Scottish Academy. We sent along Andrew Graham-Dixon.
This year's summer exhibition at the Royal Scottish Academy tells the story of how Britain first discovered and was then seduced by Spain. It's a show that contains some of the very best Spanish pictures from British collections, but it also explores Spain itself, seen through the eyes of British artists. It's a study in what happens when two very different cultures collide. The show's taken over 4 years to organise and boasts over 130 works from collections across the UK, including paintings by El Greco and Picasso. The story begins in 1808 with the Peninsular War, when British troops joined the Spanish army in their fight against Napoleon. It's a fantastically strong opening to this exhibition. It begins with two men, an Englishman, the Duke of Wellington, and Goya, Spain's greatest artist. The two meet, and Goya paints Wellington's portrait. And you could say that Britain's cultural dialogue with Spain starts here. It's crystallised in this extraordinary picture. Wellington's hardly the great gung-ho hero. He's this tired, wan, exhausted, sunburned figure. And I think there might almost be a sense in which Goya has projected onto Wellington his own sense of disgust with war. And you look into those eyes and you feel somehow that those eyes have seen the horrors of war. But I wonder if those aren't actually really Goya's eyes. I think if you want to understand why it was that Goya should have painted this curious, ambivalent picture of a military hero, then you have to come over here, because these are the images that take you inside Goya's mind at the time. They are the disasters of war, perhaps the blackest images of war ever created by any artist. And that is the reality of war as Goya saw it. The conflict was also painted by a Scottish artist, David Wilkie. It's interesting how much brighter and more optimistic Wilkie's version of the events of the Peninsular War is than Goya's. See, it was important for Wilkie not to startle the horses. He had to paint the Peninsular War very much not as a revolutionary conflict, because the last thing British aristocrats, kings, the people who might buy his pictures, the last thing they wanted to see was a bunch of revolutionaries on the wall. So what he's done is he's turned the Spanish soldiers, the guerrillas, into essentially God-fearing allies of the British. There's the priest. Okay, he's a Catholic, but he's on our side, pointing his crucifix towards the fiendish Napoleon. This is very much a vision of it designed for royal approval. Where the British Army paved the way, our writers and artists now followed. Spain was the bright, sensual other to the cold Protestant north. The very first rough guide to Spain was written by an Englishman, Richard Ford, and published in 1845. It's full of useful tips for travellers. It's incredible how popular an Englishman will become among Spaniards if he assimilates himself to their forms of society. A few bows should be made, and the taking off of one's hat, especially to ladies and in a fine climate, is no hardship. The book was a bestseller, and Spain became the new must-see destination. The British taste for Spanish art began almost by accident, and it began with Wellington, because at the decisive battle in the Peninsular War, the battle that liberated Spain, he actually relieved Napoleon's troops of this vast hoard of booty that they were carrying around with them, a whole load of the Spanish royal picture collection. Now, after the war was over, Wellington said to the Spanish king, "Here you are, have your pictures back." And the Spanish king said, "Oh, no, 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 you keep them." Now, the irony of it all was that Wellington actually didn't really want them. He took them back to London, but he actually confessed in a letter to a friend, "I don't really like Spanish art. It's not Italian art, after all." But the presence in London of the Wellington pictures stimulated a taste for Spanish art, and this room is the result. For British aristocrats, in the 19th century, Spanish art was this great unopened Pandora's box. They knew French art, they knew Italian art, but they didn't know this. They'd never seen artists like Murillo or El Greco. But there were elements of Spanish art that the British didn't really get. For some, it seemed too dark, too Catholic, too superstitious. This Zurbaran's a great example of that, this solemn, sober Zurbaran of St. Francis clasping a skull as he contemplates in joyous rapture the prospect of his own death. And that was just seen as too extreme.
It was one of the most controversial acquisitions of the 19th century.
The National Gallery in London bought it in 1853. An MP stood up in the House of Commons, can you imagine it, and said, "How on earth can we have bought this picture? It's small, black and repulsive." You got it wrong in every way, of course.
For the next generation of British artists, Spain was all about colour and light. They set out to capture the essence of the long southern summer.
Now, one of the things I really like about this show is the way in which it changes pace. These are David Bomberg's paintings. Bomberg went to Spain, I think, in search of a landscape that somehow to him would feel infused with spirituality. Now, if you look at it up close, it's almost incoherent. These could almost just be colours laid on the painter's palette. But if you take a step or two back and you get the right distance from it, you suddenly can see what he's achieved by this technique. And what he's conjured up, I think, is a wonderfully vivid pictorial equivalent for that sense of heat haze and shimmer that you get in the Spanish landscape on a hot summer's day. He talked about the spirit in the mass, this sense that he had, that somehow there was more to the world than just the world. There were greater forces at work. And you really feel that looking at that picture.
Having begun with one war, the exhibition ends with another, the Spanish Civil War, which raged through Spain during the 1930s.
In this room we find a whole series of images inspired by the Civil War by British artists. And for me, there's nothing that really encapsulates the spirit of the Spanish Civil War in these pictures. So you could say that the end of the show is a bit of an anticlimax, or it would be if it wasn't for this fantastic picture by Pablo Picasso. This is The Weeping Woman. This, for me, is Picasso thinking about Goya's great disasters of war and trying to recapture that sense of pain and anguish. So it's a desolate ending to the show, but it's a very, very strong one. So what's the moral of the story? Well, I think of this exhibition as the episodic history of a fascinating, if slightly uneasy, love affair. And long may it continue, because the fact is that there's much more to the Spanish experience than sun, sand and rivers of cheap booze. It's a country really worth exploring for its art.
And that exhibition runs until the 11th of October. Now, Edinburgh is a writer's city. Its main street is dominated by a monument to Sir Walter